Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to Smithtown Town Hall. We've gathered here today as the United States Senate and House of Representatives head back to session to call on Congress to provide direct to local government coronavirus funding as we face historic budgetary shortfalls amidst a global pandemic. I'd like to also start by making some acknowledgments. Certainly, we thank Congressman Lee Zeldin for being here. Congressman, thank you so much. We also have Brookhaven Supervisor Ed Romaine. Supervisor, thank you very much for attending. Huntington Supervisor Chad Lupinacci. Islip Supervisor Angie Carpenter. Riverhead Supervisor Yvette Aguilar. Southampton Supervisor Jay Schneiderman. Babylon Supervisor Schaefer could not be here but pledged his support for our efforts here today. New York State Assemblyman Fred Thiel. New York State Assemblyman Mike Fitzpatrick. Suffolk County Legislator Leslie Kennedy. Suffolk County Legislator Rob Trotta. Superintendent of Highways Robert Murphy. Town Councilwoman Lynn Noack. Town Councilwoman Lisa Inzarella. Riverhead Councilwoman Jody Giglio. Our Town Clerk Vin Pulio. And our County Comptroller John Kennedy. I'd like to thank you all. We appreciate you all being here in our efforts to bring some money back to local municipalities. At this time, I'd like to introduce Congressman Lee Zeldin, who has worked across the aisle, advocating for bipartisan proposal which would provide local governments with direct funding to be used for essential services and to offset lost revenues and increased cost from this ongoing pandemic. It's my pleasure to introduce Congressman Lee Zeldin.
Well, first off, I would like to thank the elected officials who are here. They come here today representing constituents. They are here with this ask not because they're looking for money for themselves. They're looking money for their county, their town, for the villages that are located within their community. So I want to thank them for their efforts and for being here today. I'd like to thank all of you, the media, to get the word out of this really important need. Over the course of the last several months, there has been legislation that's been passed and signed into law, providing support for individuals and families, for small businesses, support for state and local governments. But here's the issue, is that the CARES Act money, which was a very generous amount of money that was given to state and local governments, the population cap was set at 500,000. We're joined here today by Supervisor Ed Romaine. Brookhaven Town has a population of just under 500,000 people. So what that meant was that the 500,000 population threshold in the CARES Act might have resulted in some CDBG funding in the millions, which was good, that was important. But it didn't include that direct aid that we saw. For example, Suffolk County got $257 million in the original award. There was about $24 million that was given towards public transportation, and additional funding given since. The formula of how that CARES Act money was distributed was very strict in ensuring that money can be only used for COVID-19 related expenses. It's important for not only there to be more funding for state and local governments, but also more flexibility in how that money is spent. Not only should money be used for COVID-19 related expenses, but there are losses on the other side of the ledger as well. Continuing with that Brookhaven example, Brookhaven Town had asked for about $12 million of help. Brookhaven Town has a balanced budget and a AAA bond rating. So while there is a debate that goes on in Washington understanding that there are many state and local governments all throughout New York and other parts of the country, we're going into the COVID-19 crisis. They already had fiscal issues. What's very important to note is that you're looking at a number of elected officials who come from big towns and small towns. They're here from the county level and we have state legislators here as well. You have many elected officials behind me who have been working really hard for a long time to have their budget as balanced and responsible going into COVID-19. Supervisor Wareheim referenced a funding formula which has bipartisan support in Congress. It's called the Direct Support for Communities Act. This is a way of distributing funds for local governments, including the local governments represented by the elected officials here today. It was introduced in the House by myself and Congressman Antonio Delgado, a Democratic member of the House from the Hudson Valley, and in the Senate by Senator Schumer and Senator Gillibrand. Now, the way it would work is that half the pot goes for counties and half the pot goes to towns, cities, and villages. For the pot of money that goes to the counties, it would be distributed based on population unless the CDBG entitlement is more favorable for that county. The funding that would be given to towns, villages, cities, 70% would be based on CDBG entitlement. The other 30% would go to non-CDBG entitlement, paid based on population through the state. Language was added to the formula that the money that goes to the state to be distributed to these non-CDBG entitlement communities can be used to supplement state funding. It can be not used to supplant state funding. It's very important that if and when Congress provides additional support for state and local governments, that the money that is sent from DC to Albany actually makes its way to the constituents represented by the men and women who are here. Now, as far as the pot of money goes, this is important to discuss as well. To give you an example of what that formula means, $50 billion of a national pot for counties to $50 billion is about 235 to 240 million more for Suffolk County government alone. You do the math, 100 billion would mean that it's nearly $500 million for Suffolk County government. To give you a reference, $25 million of a national pot for Brookhaven Town. Remember earlier I said Brookhaven Town with a AAA bond rating and a balanced budget was asking for $12 million. $25 billion of a national pot would give Brookhaven Town $12 million. Now, why is this all important? It is okay when you're going into negotiations to have your negotiating position. Sometimes it's to the extremes. Sometimes your rhetoric is to the extremes as well. And when this negotiation started for a next round of funding for state and local governments, there was primarily 4 people at the table. It was Senator Schumer and Speaker Pelosi, Mark Meadows as White House Chief of Staff, and Steve Mnuchin as the Treasury Secretary. The negotiating position for state and local governments was $0 for this entire pot, this entire negotiation. It was $900 billion was the position taken by the congressional Democratic leadership. That's fine when you're sitting down at the table to have your positions, but then what you need to do is negotiate and compromise. Now, as far as the $900 billion position, I want to say genuinely, I am grateful for and I appreciate the efforts of the New York congressional delegation and Senator Schumer at that table asking for so much money for the state and local governments. It is that bipartisan spirit that's required in order for there to actually be a final number that gets over the finish line. It's important to point out that the $900 billion number is actually far more than the state and local governments are even asking for. So New York State had asked for $60 billion for Albany. Now that number is $60 billion for New York, $30 billion for Albany, funding for MTA, for Port Authority, that's important, for New York City, for these local governments. When that ask was $60 billion just for Albany, the nationwide ask for the Governors Association was $500 billion. Some of the states weighed in then that $500 billion was more than they had needed. But since then, New York isn't asking for $60 billion for Albany, they're asking for $30 billion. That's the state portion. That was $500 billion. All local governments, including the National Association of Counties, the mayors, everybody got together and rallied behind a $250 billion ask for local governments. The negotiating position of the $900 billion includes $375 billion for local governments. That's $125 billion more than the local governments are asking for. Again, I want to thank the entire New York congressional delegation, including Senator Schumer, who's sitting at the table, for asking for that money. The position of the White House, Mark Meadows and Steven Mnuchin, is not zero. They're at around $150 billion. You have $150 billion and $900 billion. So we're going to get right to the heart of what needs to happen. And we have a lot of elected officials here who have a lot of experience in figuring out how to reach bipartisan compromise. That was the key for everyone here behind me, their ability to get their communities so strongly through a really bad outbreak that hit us hard. You have to find a negotiation, a compromise between the $900 billion number and the $150 billion number. If you insist on $900 billion and that's it, and you will not accept a dollar less, the problem is that their constituents, the great men and women behind me, will end up getting nothing. It's time to compromise. Here's the second thing. We're getting really close to an election on November 3rd. And what that means is that if you cut this deal, Speaker Pelosi will look good. Senator Schumer will look good. And President Trump will look good. And in DC world, that's a problem. Because people don't want their political opposition to be part of wins. This is a moment in time for everyone to come together for the common good, to seek compromise however possible. That means not only do you have to have a willingness to reach an agreement on the number, but you also have to have an understanding and a willingness to the fact that your political opposition will also be part of a win. Because what's most important is that your constituents and this country is able to move forward. A next deal should include additional funding for small businesses. It should include additional support for families. Even though we're focusing so much here today on the topic of state and local governments, that does not mean that any of us here today believe that we shouldn't also be talking about the need to provide additional support to individuals and for small businesses to keep our economy strong, to keep families strong. But I'd be remiss if I didn't finish the same way that I started. I want to start off with and end with a very heartfelt thank you to all of the men and women behind me. These are Democrats and Republicans at the state level, the county level, and the town level. And they are here not for themselves. They are not asking for money for themselves. They are here advocating strongly, fiercely, passionately on behalf of their constituents who need Congress to act not as Republicans first, not as Democrats first, but as Americans first. I thank you to Supervisor Wertheim for his continued leadership and for hosting us here today.
Okay, at this time, I would like to begin to call our supervisors up to the podium for their comments, and then we will have state and county representatives after that. So we're going to go from east to west because Supervisor Schneiderman made a long trip. Southampton Supervisor Jay Schneiderman.
Thank you, Supervisor. Thank you, Congressman. So let's see, this is, I guess, 7 months since this pandemic began. It's been a long time, and we have been asking for money for a long time. This pandemic has had all kinds of costs at the local level. We have been working super hard to protect everyone. We in Southampton, we have a police department with 100 men and women. We have a lot of services that we continue to deliver. We had to reinvent government basically through this pandemic to keep people safe. And there's a cost to that, and we have been asking for help from the very beginning, asking for help. 7 months now, we have been under a state of emergency not just nationally, not just in the New York State, but at the local level. 7-month state of emergency without any federal help. That's unbelievable. We need some dollars out of Washington to come back to help us continue to keep people safe. We keep asking. We're hoping that that's going to change soon. We need a package. The first CARES Act, and the number is arbitrary, right? There's 500,000 people. That's arbitrary. Brookhaven didn't make it. One of the biggest townships in the entire country didn't make it to 500,000. Town of Southampton, and I can tell you, if you look at the census, we're about 60,000 people. We've had several 100,000 people for months because a lot of New Yorkers came out to their summer homes and took up full-time residence. So I've been managing a town, probably 200,000 people, but that's not enough apparently either to get any help. The entire East End, we're probably close to 500,000 if you combine us, but we get nothing. The county got $257 million. That's a lot. And they have police, and they have sheriffs, and they have a lot of things. But so do we. We need the help. So I'm asking our congressmen to continue this fight. We're speaking as supervisors. I chair the East End Supervisors and Mayors Association. Yes, I had the longest trip today, coming from town of Southampton out here. But it's an important message that I'm delivering, is that please, get us some money at the local level so we can continue to help keep people safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Supervisor. Next, I'd like to invite up to the mic our Suffolk County's largest town, Brookhaven Supervisor Ed Romaine.
Thank you. This is a very sad time for our country. We're going through a once-in-a-lifetime experience that we haven't seen in a long time, where a pandemic has shut down our economy and affected this nation in a way that will reverberate for the next at least 100 years. We are at the epicenter. We have made it through. We are praying to God for a vaccine. But through it all, we're no different. Government is no different than the average family. Our revenues are down, and we still must provide services. We need some help. We need some leadership. I thank Congressman Zeldin for this bill that he is sponsoring with his fellow Democrat in the House and with our 2 Democratic senators in the Senate. This is not a partisan bill. This is a rescue bill. And we need to be rescued so that our local governments can continue to function and provide basic services. Help us, please. Let's all work together. This should not be a nation divided. This should not be a nation yelling partisan slogans. This should be a nation yelling, let's come together. Let's help one another. That's what this is about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Supervisor Romaine. Next, I'd like to introduce up Supervisor of a town that was hit the hardest by this pandemic and has done a wonderful job, as we all have, Islip Supervisor Angie Carpenter.
Thank you so much, Supervisor Wareheim and Congressman Zeldin, for your leadership. Certainly, it is not something I'm proud of that our town of Islip, was hit the hardest. There are hamlets in the town of Islip, collectively, 3 of them, that had more COVID cases than 22 states across the country. And we are struggling. And as the previous supervisor said, we are providing the services. Actually, we're providing more services with less revenue. We've seen a decrease in our revenues. We've not only seen that decrease from the normal revenues during the course of doing business as a town, but we have been told that there's going to be a 20% decrease in state aid for our CHIPS funding, our highway funding, and 20% for aid to municipalities. So on top of everything that we've had to endure, now we're faced with decreased aid from the state of New York. Add to that all of the expenses and the hit that we've taken because of COVID, and then another little whammy that we got a couple of weeks ago, the storm, and all of the damage that caused that we had to rectify. So I implore everyone to please join together. Senator Schumer has been, from the beginning, advocating for that direct funding to the towns and the villages. If we don't get that, we're in the throes of putting our budget together now. On top of everything else, we're faced with a state-mandated tax cap of 2%, which actually is 1.5% this year. So with all of this increased funding loss and all of the increased expenses that we've had, it is going to be impossible to deliver a budget that doesn't increase taxes. And the people that can least afford it are the ones that are going to be hit. So under the leadership of Lee Zeldin, we are counting on you, Congressman, to instill in your colleagues in Washington the absolute import of working together for the people that they are committed to representing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Supervisor. Next, I'd like to introduce Huntington Town Supervisor Chad Lubinacci.
Good morning, and thank you to Congressman Zeldin and his leadership in this area on this bipartisan piece of legislation, and also thank you to the Supervisor Werheim for hosting today. And as was mentioned and articulated already, we are a bipartisan group from all levels of government advocating for direct aid, which is very important. And since the middle of March through today, our towns have provided the essential services that they needed, even from the beginning, whether it was our senior centers providing hot meals for the most vulnerable, or our public safety agents out on the areas making sure that our facilities were safe and secure, such as our beaches and our parks, which has seen more people come through them the past several months than probably in the past 15 years. And also that the garbage was picked up and the recycling was picked up, all essential services, which is very important to note that the continuity of government continued, our workforce was out in full, but at the same time, we received no federal assistance during this time. So it's very important to continue to advocate and make sure this legislation is passed, to make sure that the federal government invests in the economic well-being and the future of our municipalities, but also as we continue to prepare if and when that second wave comes this fall. And that's very important to note, that it's not over yet. We don't know when it's going to be over. It's not a crisis like a terrorist attack or natural disaster that comes and goes within a period of time. The future is unknown, and that's very important for our budgeting and, of course, as we prepare. So time and time again, America and New York and Long Island has come together and has endured, and we know that we'll continue to do this. So thank you to Congressman Zeldin for all his leadership in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor. At this time, before I bring the county and state reps up, I'd just like to read a collective statement, and you've heard from all of our supervisors, so we can sum it up by saying that we all watch C-SPAN.
Supervisor Aguilar.
Oh, she's going to speak? You want to speak? Okay. Supervisor Aguilar from Town of Riverhead.
Thank you. Everything, Congressman Zeldin, for your support. We are in dire need of funds. Unfortunately, Suffolk County has experienced a great shortfall. There's $257 million in the county waiting to be dispersed, and we need that money. We need it desperately. COVID-19 has the similar effects of a war: financial instability, death, unemployment, people needing assistance from our government, and we need it. We are only 32,000 residents, unlike my colleague Ed Romaine. He's a giant next to us. We need it more than anyone. Please, everyone, I urge you to go to your local leaders, your county leaders, your state leaders, and your Washington leaders, and ask them to support this bipartisan bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Supervisor. So, as I said, a collective statement, and then we'll have our county and state reps come up. We all watch C-SPAN. We follow the news daily and are cognizant of various positions on a fourth coronavirus relief package. However, our hope and purpose for today is that our federal counterparts will hear our perspective and bring it to the table when heading back in session. All too often, by the time federal funding makes it down the chain, the state and county, to the town and villages, it's either already spent or there are endless application processes involved. And as stated here today, all of our supervisors here are beginning our annual fiscal budgets. So that's vital. We're already seeing the results of what's happening. In these unprecedented times, we need a line of relief aid that funnels directly to local governments. That is how we keep our local economies alive, save our local fire and EMS companies, provide education in a safe manner, and give the taxpayers the essential services that impact everyday living. In 6 months, we've endured a global pandemic, civil unrest, a devastating and very expensive tropical storm, and now we must produce operating budgets for 2021, anticipating cuts in state funding, revenue shortfalls, and rate increases for services and contracts. To say we've done more with less is an understatement. Every town administration here has a long track record of being fiscally prudent, every single one of them. And when it mattered the most, we took the necessary steps to mitigate the economic fallout. We all work together in service to the people of our communities. We're asking that Congress do the same. We're asking you to think about the moms and dads forced to choose between child care and paying bills. Think about the emergency responders who need funding to properly sanitize equipment and protect themselves from this virus. Think about the mom and pop shops owners and the residents barely keeping their heads above water. These are your constituents too, as Congressman Zeldin alluded to. The path forward for our constituents begins and ends with local government. We will continue to serve at the front lines, operating and facilitating essential services, but we need Congress to make a unified commitment in support of a direct to local funding relief bill for towns and villages. Thank you very much. At this time, I would like to ask to come up for a few comments Suffolk County Legislator Rob Trotter.
All right, I'm going to make this very, very simple and put this in perspective. Suffolk County suffered a $100 million shortfall because of this virus. And that man right there got us $283 million in the bank for this county, and he's here now getting us more. I applaud you. I thank you. What you're up against is staggering. Let's think about that again. We faced a $100 million shortfall. He got us $283 million so far, and now he's here fighting for more. This county, since before coronavirus, had 8 bond downgrades. We should not be bailing out counties that, states that were, and counties that were in fiscal mess beforehand. We shouldn't be doing it. Look at around here. It's beautifully maintained. AAA bond rating. These people need the help. We should not be bailing out counties and states that were headed for bankruptcy beforehand. Mismanagement is something we should not accept, and I thank you, Congressman, for helping bail out Suffolk County.
Thank you very much, Rob. Next, I'd like to invite to the podium Legislator Leslie Kennedy.
Thank you, Supervisor Wareheim, for hosting this. Thank you, Senators, Congressman Zeldin. I just gave you a raise. And thank you to everyone who's standing behind me here, supporting our constituents. I want to thank you, Lee, for putting this bipartisan bill in. I just want to say, if we don't start working in a bipartisan nature, we're going down. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Our state representatives are here. I'd like to invite up to the podium Assemblyman Fred Thiel.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Supervisor, and all our local government officials for having this event today. It's of critical importance. Before I was a state assemblyman, I was a town supervisor in the town of Southampton, where Jay Schneiderman comes from, and I was a county legislator also. Local government is the first line of defense. They have been there doing the job, protecting us when it comes to the coronavirus. Now in Albany, I don't just represent Long Island, I'm the chair of the Assembly Local Governments Committee. So it is imperative, and we continue to fight for our local governments. And certainly part of that was legislation that we passed in Albany on a bipartisan basis to give our local governments increased flexibility to be able to use the dollars they already have, whether it's in reserve funds or interfund transfers, to be able to have flexibility to be able to deal with this virus. Now, we need money. The state's $15 billion in the hole. Local governments are facing some of the same problems. And this is not a bailout. This is facing a disaster. We've asked local governments to do things they've never been asked to before. It costs money. They've lost revenue. We're not asking for a bailout. These are our tax dollars that we send to Washington, and we need to get them back. In New York, every year, it's always been the case where we send more to Washington than we get back. We just want our needs to be addressed during this pandemic. And it needs to be done on a bipartisan basis. We're not talking about getting money to states and counties and towns. Yes, we are, but really where the money's going to go is to education, to health care, to the environment, to public safety. And if we are not able to meet those basic needs, our communities are going to be in trouble. And not only that, we're going to be facing further economic difficulty. You can't have the kind of budget cuts that are going to happen across the board and be able to sustain an economic recovery. So I implore our members in Congress, including Congressman Zeldin, we need to have action, and we need to have action now, and we need to make sure that our local governments get the resources we need as we continue to fight the coronavirus. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman. I'd like to invite up to the podium for comments Assemblyman Michael Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Supervisor Wareheim, and thank you, Congressman Zeldin. Lee, we appreciate the effort you're making on behalf of all of us at the state, county, and local levels of government. Look, no one is going to get a blank check here. When I look at this legislation, it's reasonable. This is a reasonable compromise to meet the needs caused by this pandemic and in a smaller way, the storm, the recent storm, to offer and deliver the services that our residents need. So when I look at this bill, the term is reasonable. It's a reasonable compromise. So Speaker Pelosi, Senator Schumer, please join hands with President Trump, put the politics aside, let's get this done, and let's bring relief to our local levels of government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assemblyman. The gentleman wants to say a few words who knows a little bit about funding. County Comptroller John Kennedy.
Supervisor, thank you for hosting this. Congressman Zeldin, thank you for being the loud voice that speaks to what absolutely is needed at a time of crisis and peril in our county. Not only have you secured the $257 million for Suffolk County, which, Congressman, thank you, but guess what? It's not enough. The hole is bigger than that, and because of that, thank you for securing our access into the MLF, the Municipal Lending Facility. As we speak, we are going in for a $100 million short-term note, and we cannot get anybody to buy our paper in the market at a BBB negative outlook. This coronavirus has wreaked havoc on every aspect of what we do at county and local governments, ladies and gentlemen. Make no mistake, peril is putting it mildly. We are on the verge of utter collapse, and without intervention and swift intervention from the federal government, our county government and local governments will no longer exist as we know them here. And guess what? We deserve better. We deserve better from Washington. We deserve a government that is going to actually be receptive to this crisis, and we're confident, Congressman, that you're going to go ahead and carry the day. Thank you, and we will be behind you the whole way.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. I want to thank all of my colleagues, elected colleagues behind us here. And certainly we want to thank you, Congressman Zeldin, for taking the time to come here and fight for us like you always do. We're all behind you in this endeavor. We'll be here when you need us. And in closing, I think all my colleagues will agree, one thing you can count on when it comes to local government, town supervisors, and village mayors, the buck truly stops here. We know it, we feel the pain, and we know what we need from Washington. And Congressman Zeldin, we'll be behind you to go bring it home. Thank you very much, and that ends our press conference.